And it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in a clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on podcastufo.com. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello, and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. Our guest this evening is Paul Dean. He's from Melbourne, Australia. And Paul is a senior researcher with the Victorian UFO Action, which is a group dedicated to investigating UFO sightings. And he has spent decades searching for the truth about reports of UFOs. And he likes to look at these sightings scientifically as possible. He also has a blog, so we'll have plenty to talk about. And we'll be doing a little time traveling because it is Thursday in Australia and Wednesday here. Always fun. So we know Thursday does exist. Before our guest, we have Alejandro Rojas coming up with the latest UFO news. And again, I have to mention this, so pardon me. Like I said, a lot of people don't listen to every show. So we are live on podcastufo.com. Right on the sidebar, there's the player, and that's every Wednesday at 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we are also still on the Dark Matter Digital Network. And that is a pre-recorded show from Wednesday, and that's on Thursdays at 9 to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So check that out. And that network is not going anywhere. As far as I know, it's going to be carrying on. Heather Wade is doing well in Art Bell's place. And don't forget, if you listen to our show live, it's always 100% free. And the first hour is a podcast that is always free as well. I'll be talking a little bit more about that at the end of hour one. And we have a chat room. Don't forget that. You're welcome to jump in the chat room and pose a question or two for the guests, or many questions for the guests. We have a couple emails that came in, and I'm not sure. I'm not going to. If we can get the phone straightened out by the time this show goes live, then I will announce the phone number right now. We're still working on that, and it's time to bring in Alejandro Rojas from openminds.tv. How are you, Alejandro?
I am good. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. I know you're crazy busy, and I really appreciate you taking the time to help us out with the news here.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah. So what's going on? Do you want to talk about your preparation for the event coming up, or you want to talk a little bit about news? What's going on?
Yeah, let's talk some news. I guess it'll get into the other.
Yeah, okay.
So, to start off, I guess, a couple things that we haven't written about that would be fun to talk about are the X-Files, which I guess is doing so well that it's going to have another season. So, have you watched
already?
them?
No,
Yeah.
I haven't. I saw Bruce McAbee's comments about it on Facebook. But no, I have not. Have not seen it.
So it's doing great, and it's really good. I really liked it. It's heavily into UFO mythology. I mean, really, the first episode kind of outlined all of the mythology and the most, in my opinion, wildest conspiracy theories, and that's kind of where they're going. So that's kind of fun. And then this was kind of neat, too, because it helped us get some local coverage of the conference and some of our research. So there's a local legend of a crash of a UFO, and the local Fox News came and did an interview here and posted a couple of cuts of that interview with me on their website, and they aired it after the X-Files. So that's cool.
Oh, that's great. Hey, is that the one where it shows an aerial view of a crashed flying saucer that I saw, maybe months ago? When they were filming? No, that's something else?
I'm not sure what you're referring to. If you're referring to the X-Files,
yes,
they do have an instance of where they include, these ideas about Roswell.
Okay, because while they were filming, someone took an aerial shot of a crashed UFO one day and posted it.
I can't believe you haven't watched the show.
I'm sorry.
You are like so behind.
I know.
I mean, you are talking about stuff that is just all been discovered now that the show is out.
Wow. Yeah.
So watch the show.
All right.
I'm disappointed in you, Mr.
I'll stay quiet on this side.
However, let's talk about this. So also in related to marketing of the X-Files, the CIA released. So this is where people get it wrong. They always get it wrong. And this is so frustrating, is that whenever the FBI says something about a UFO file or the CIA or whoever, the news always says released new files. No, people, that is so wrong. All they're usually doing is highlighting files that are already in their records, in their archives. And I think that's what Bruce Maccabee gets frustrated about, because he's one of the people, along with John Greenwald, who has helped to get those files released. And so those files have been released. They're nothing new. So, yeah, but the CIA, it's kind of cool they did. They released a file that talked about how to film a UFO and then some of their other UFO files. So that's been getting a lot of news, and that was kind of cool.
Yeah, I understand why people get frustrated, but also I think it's really good that it stirs up a lot of conversation, even though it's, false conversation. At least people are looking at these files.
Yeah. But the problem, I guess, what the issue is, it's great that it stirs the pot and it gets people talking about this stuff. However, these journalists should be doing their due diligence. They should be doing their research so they make sure that they are accurate. And I don't know why they feel they can be inaccurate and completely screw up and be doofuses, be completely inept in their jobs, which is what they're doing.
It's probably because they take the UFO subject so lightly, and that it doesn't really matter as much as a story that you can get sued over or something like that. That's just speculation, but maybe that's
you're probably right. And that's, I guess, what makes it doubly frustrating if that's the case. But either way, for any story, I think they should be, upholding their ethical duties to be accurate in their reporting, which is kind of frustrating. Now, there's this story about and I think this ties in about the Planned Parenthood, and these guys who created those videos, how they are getting indicted and they're in trouble for fraud because they say they were just trying to be journalists, but they got in trouble because they spun and they falsely reported things. And really, of course, the media and everybody's all over them for that, and they're getting in trouble, rightfully so. But the media is doing the same thing when they falsely report on anything such as UFOs. And so it's just very frustrating situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But I have another story when it comes to government files.
Just one more thing. How would anyone call the media on falsely reporting? It can't really go anywhere, when it comes to something like this.
You're right. All you can do is all you can do is call them out and have their peers call them out. And really, that's why it's good that we have Lee Spiegel, who is kind of the only champion for accuracy in this field when it comes to mainstream media. Although there are people like Leslie Kean or Nick Pope who write in mainstream media, but they're not like staff writers like Lee Spiegel is. And so he often calls them out. I know recently he's done that. He does that often with misreported stories. And I know his CIA story is not out yet, but he's working on one. And I have a feeling that a large part of that story will be just that, calling out these other news agencies to say, no, you are misreporting when you say these are new files. They're not. Do your work. Actually read the websites that you're referring to, and you'll see that these are files that have been in their archives that they are highlighting in order to bring some attention to their website. And capitalize on this fervor around the X-Files.
Right. Wow. Well, we'll see. I'd be interested to read that article. myself.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to write one, but I just haven't had the time with all this stuff with the Congress.
Right, and you said there was something else that tied into this?
Well, yeah. So I kind of plugged this last time on your show, I think, about something really cool that John Greenwald was working on.
Everyone's waiting for that.
Yeah. Ooh, are they? Yeah, here it is, people. Well, people who read our website knew about this. What I posted it Monday night, I posted the story about this. And this is the only story I've had time to write recently. I am writing a press release that's kind of fun. I can tell you about that if you want later. But this story is John Greenwald once again being told by the government, we've lost UFO files. So what happens is this. He had these DIA UFO files that he got in 1996, early on when he was doing this work of using the Freedom of Information to get UFO files. And this is the Defense Intelligence Agency I'm referring to. However, some of these files are heavily redacted, meaning that parts of these files are blacked out. And so you don't know what information was there. Usually because when they release the files, parts of the files are still classified, so they black them out. Well, you can do something called an MDR, where you request that they review these files, and if that material that's blacked out is no longer classified, then they can give you the files that aren't blacked out or less blacked out, and so you can see what was going on there.
Wow.
This is what happened just a couple of years ago with some documents about spy planes where all the Area 51 stuff was blacked out, but then they unredacted it because of an MDR request, and they let the Area 51 be seen to the public because then it was declassified, and that's how, the big story came about Area 51 finally being admitted by the CIA. So when John asked them to, in this MDR, to review them, they said, we lost the files. They told him essentially, we can't find them, so if all we have are the redacted ones, so we don't have the original, so sorry, there's nothing we can do. Even though he provided them with all of the files, they said, well, send us the exact titles of the files, which of course are in the files he provided to them, but they said, anyway, go through these hoops of sending us those titles, and we'll do another search. But of course, that search, I'm sure, is going to be fruitless. He's going through the effort of doing that just to see what happens, but of course, he's got no faith they'll find him. If they couldn't find him with actually having the files themselves, they're not going to be able to find him with just the titles. And this, interestingly, happened to him just last year. He did the same thing with NSA documents, and these were important documents that were part of a lawsuit in the 70s. These are the ones that Stanton Friedman holds up that are all super blacked out. And he did the same thing. He did an MDR and said, hey, clean these up, give us some more information. And they said, oh, sorry, we lost those originals, so we can't give you any more information.
Do you think that is possible that they're just being lazy or they just don't want to do it?
It's just really difficult to say. Now, if there was a group out there who, and there was a group that had written about this, but if there were some people wanting to spend some money, you can sue them. That's essentially what Leslie Kane did, because NASA told her they lost their files on the Kecksburg incident. And so luckily, she had some funds or some people willing to kick in some funds. They sued, and NASA said, well, come look. We're serious. We really did lose them. Leslie, you can come to NASA and help us look for them. Yeah. So Leslie went to NASA, and she did look at, and she said, yeah, they did lose them, unfortunately. So in that case, we were able to check up, and they actually did lose them. In this case, it's hard to say. Who knows? Did they really lose them? What the hell are they doing throwing them away? Especially the NSA ones that were part of a lawsuit. They obviously were great interest to the public. And UFO files, like CIA has admitted with the X-Files, or the FBI writes this story occasionally, how their most popular files that people look at in their archives are UFO files.
That's right.
So people are interested, yet they're throwing them away?
Unless they're misfiled, refiled, that could be another thing. I would think that they would digitalize whatever they have when it comes to actually withdrawing these things out to send them instead of just refiling them. You would imagine that they would digitalize them. But
you never know. Government budgets, of course, have been decreasing over the years. And so they really don't have manpower. It could be an issue of just without that manpower, it's easier to throw them away because they just can't. They don't have the budgets they need. I have no idea. But it's another startling issue of the X-Files being lost.
Now, what is John's topic going to be at the UFO Congress this year?
He's going to talk about these two cases, the NSA issue, and some more. But he's going to, his big thing is that he makes a very strong argument of how the government said they stopped looking into UFOs in 1969, but they didn't. That there's evidence in the files that he and others have retrieved that show that they have not, they have had a continued interest. And he has some
in everything.
Yep, and he has some really interesting cases, including one we were talking about Lee Spiegel earlier, where Lee Spiegel was going to write a story about one of his files that showed this, and this was back in 2011. And when Lee Spiegel asked about the file that said that they still ask for UFOs to be reported by their pilots, that when Lee went to post his story, they had taken that chapter out of this file.
Really?
And this was a chapter they had in there for decades that UFO researchers were well aware of. But just coincidentally, during that week period of time where Lee was writing and gathering his information for his story, the first time he looked, it was there. By the time he posted his story a few days later, it was changed.
Unbelievable. It's
shocking.
The thing that's really funny about this is I would think, of course, they'd want them to report something mysterious in the sky, bottom line, but they just don't want to admit it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think that they just don't want to be harassed by people asking about what has been reported to them. And that's what this section of the document was. It was called service. So essentially highly important reports. And you're supposed to report, missiles, foreign aircraft, stuff like this. And unidentified flying objects was one of those. In fact, Canada used to be, with NORAD, Canada's a partner. And I've got this old poster. And in fact, Canada has it on one of their government websites, which has this exact section in a poster. And they highlight, report these things. And in the part that says UFO, it has a disc and like a Buck Rogers kind of ship drawn on this poster as to what to report. So it's really fascinating. So that report or that reporting structure was in place for decades until Lee Spiegel asked about it and wanted to make a big deal out of it. So really weird.
The Huffington Post is a pretty major, media source where they know they're going to get a lot of, there's going to be a lot of people looking.
They're always one of the top 5, usually sometimes in the top 3 when it comes to the most viewed news sites on the internet.
Yeah.
So they're up there with the CNNs and the MSNBCs and all of those. They are up there, one of the top dogs. So, so that's a big deal. So it is pretty cool.
We're going a little long on the news. We're already at 20 minutes or so. But that's okay. If you have also a UFO story as well?
I do, but I want to talk. Can I talk about my press release I'm writing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. Sure.
Because that's more fun. We do have some interesting sightings at openminds.tv, so go check it out. A couple videos. None of them are groundbreaking, but they're interesting stories. However, this press release I'm writing, like right now, is about academics debating alien abduction at the UFO Congress. And what I love about this is I'm writing, this isn't what you think. They're not debating whether or not there are alien abductions. To this group, that's a foregone conclusion. Instead, they're debating whether it's good or bad. And on this panel, we're going to have David Jacobs, who believes aliens are among us. I'm sure you've probably had him on the show.
Yeah, a few times. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they're familiar with his perspective. We're also having another former professor, Joe Lewells, who is on the positive side. He even relates this to the spirituality of the whole experience and everything. And then we're going to have Barbara Lamb, who's a certified marriage and family therapist. And she's, of course, says she's talked to thousands of people. And then Yvonne Smith, who also says she's talked to 1,000 people, or thousands. She's going to be moderating this panel. But it ought to be fun because we have these two guys on just the polar opposites. And then we have these two ladies, these certified therapists who also have worked in this, more in the middle. So I think it should be fascinating. And I think the media is going to be fascinated by the idea that these academics are going to be discussing this. So this ought to be a lot of fun.
Wow. Yeah, I like any type of open discussion like that. I always think there's much more going on than someone just going up with a PowerPoint and, talking about whatever their topic is. When there's interaction, new things get brought up that wouldn't even be thought about. So, yeah, that'll be great. So thanks so much, Alejandro, and we'll be talking to you next week.
Thank you, buddy. Talk to you soon.
All right, everyone, hang in there for the quick music break. We'll be right back with Paul Dean. Well, welcome to the show, Paul.
Hi, it's very good to be on here. I haven't done a show in America for a long time.
Really? Well, I have mentioned a number of times on this show that although Australia has, may get the number wrong, approximately 26 million people, it's usually in the second or third top listeners to this show.
Really?
Yes.
Jeez.
And so that's got to mean something in a lot of different ways, I think.
Well, we've got a lot of time on our hands. That's what.
Never thought of that. And also, we have Shane, and he's a faithful listener in the chat room. He's always on here. He's in a different time zone. He's at 11 a.m. You're at noon time, or just afternoon right now.
That's right.
So I would like for you to tell the listener who may have never heard of you, your background, and what got you interested in UFOs, but basically more of your background from the start of your interest up to now.
Right. Okay. So I'm 37 years old, married with 2 kids in a huge city called Melbourne. What actually happened was, look, I've got a very, I suppose, scientific and technical mind. When I was very young, my father was actually in the army, and before. A little bit before I was born, so 1975, my father had something, he was driving alone, he had something unusual follow him at night, middle of the night, and actually shine down a light on the car, and he's never been able to explain it, and he doesn't particularly even like talking about it, but it was certainly something that he wasn't expecting. Now the other thing is so he told me about this when I was in my early teens. The other thing is that if you're a Melburnian, if you live in Australia, there's one case that you will never, ever, ever get away from, and that's the disappearance of pilot Frederick Valentic. And for anyone that doesn't know, I'll cut it right short, but a 21-year-old pilot in a single-engine Cessna took off from a suburban airport in Melbourne, headed southwest, then due south, or nearly due south, and he jumped on the radio at about sunset, and he had 12-minute, over a period of 12 minutes, he had quite a long conversation with the flight services unit, so air traffic controller, flight services unit person at our international airport, and he variously described being harassed by 4 bright lights, 4 bright green lights, a metallic object. This is all in official government paperwork. I mean, his final words were, Melbourne, that aircraft is hovering on top of me again. It's hovering and it's not an aircraft. And then he was never seen again. I mean, there was no plane, there was no wreckage, nothing. So this mystery has been, plaguing Australia and Melbourne for nearly 40 years. And it comes up in the media all the time. And I remember being a young boy and hearing about this. And, of course, you're absolutely tantalised because not only do you have a pilot that's reporting something really strange, probably harassing his aircraft, and then you've got the problem that he was never found. I mean, they found oil slicks, but they turned out to be from a diesel freighter, a seagoing vessel. I mean, that's the closest lead we got. There was just, the accident investigation review came up presumed fatal, unknown cause of accident, but his final words were, in some ways quite chilling. So that's how I got into it. But what I did differently than a lot of people, I tried to be as objective as I could. So, this is back way before the internet, so I was relying on books only. So books from the library, books from all sorts of libraries, maybe newspaper articles. And what I gravitated towards was, generally as a teenager and into my 20s, I was quite adept to assuming that virtually all of it was absolute rubbish. But what kept me going was the fact that every now and again you'd see specific, well-known cases where high-ranking military intelligence or agency people from all over the world, could be, from Japan's self-defense forces through to America's, Air Combat Command or Strategic Air Command through to Britain's, Undersecretary for Air, whatever, people of high caliber making some pretty incredible statements. We've all heard of the really famous statement, like, Nathan Twining, Lieutenant General's, the phenomenon is real, not visionary or fictitious. That's in a famous memo from 1948. Now 47. So those sort of statements, whether they were in radio interviews with those people retired, or in actual official letters and memos, or discussion papers, position statements, and so on. That's what got me, because I just thought, how can people who are running 3,000, 5,000 troops, or an entire corps of intelligence personnel, or half a cryptography agency, or like 3 squadrons of combat jets worth $500 million, how can these people be saying, making these comments sometimes repeatedly, that you'd have to worry about who's running certain Western militaries and defence outfits if you've got people making these claims. I mean, there are dozens of these famous quotes. There is extraordinary statements right through to the 2000s. And that's what I got interested in. And the other thing that I was interested in was there were just simply, it appeared to me in books that there were just simply cases that, you took everything away. They could not be explained by anything mundane, nothing astronomical, nothing man-made, certainly not, elaborate hoaxes involving, hundreds of people, and not a person breathes a word of it. I just didn't buy it. So I had to assume that there was something going on. So I studied the phenomenon. I read books. I shy right away from, the more, I suppose, extreme, flamboyant, or stuff that wouldn't be testable in court. Like if someone comes to me and says, can you give me some evidence that would stand up in court? I'd probably give them something like a 20 or 30 page analysis of radar track files. But if someone came to me, but if I gave them, say a possible, repeat abduction case of a 10-year-old, that it wouldn't. I think the judge would throw it out. Now, whether it happened or not, to me is irrelevant. I solely look for evidence that would stand up to a judge. That's what I enjoy doing, and not enough people do it. So I've taken on that role, certainly here in Australia. So what I specialise in is government documents, government files, basically from all over the world: Australian, United States, Canada, Brazil, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Russia, Belarus, South Korea, New Zealand. So, so I maintain an enormous archive of government files here. I work with some of the old school people, that some of the listeners might remember an infamous book in 1984 that came out called Clear Intent, which just blew the lid on post-Project Blue Book study of UFO reporting, investigation, to the US Department of Defense. I mean, Barry Greenwood and Lawrence Fawcett wrote the book with the help of Robert Todd. And, I can't pronounce his name. Is it Alejandro Rojas, the guy that was on before?
Alejandro Rojas. It's not actually the Spanish way. That's I won't do it, but it's totally different. But that's the American way of pronouncing his name.
Yeah, well, I can't say. Alejandro Rojas was discussing before the release of the CIA files, and that the CIA might make a bit of a release on their website, and I could not agree with Rojas more. The media are absolutely hopeless. They've done this time and time again. The biggest one recently was with John Greenwald's put, almost all the Blue Book case files, case by case PDF'd, and Office of Air Force Special Investigation files, plus administration and policy files for Air Technical Intelligence Center Project Blue Book, and the AFOSI headquarters and field commands. He put them on his website, and the media was saying things like, finally, these files were released. Well, in fact, they were redacted. They were released redacted in 1975 in microfilm to the National Archives of Maxwell Air Force Base Historical Agency. And then they were, you could order them by microfilm, so that, Hynek studied them. They've been on Fold 3 for years, and National Archive, the media are useless. But what I particularly study is, I suppose, post 1969, so when the US government at least and a few others got out of the UFO game, when they said basically, look, there is nothing to this, it's very interesting, but there's no science that we can really do. When they got out of it, they didn't really get out of it. The reporting channels that Alejandro Rojas was talking about before. He was talking about a chapter in the Air Force Instruction 206-12, I think it is, 206-10, sorry. He was saying that there was a chapter in there for UFOs. It's called Service Instructions, Communications, Vital Intelligence Sightings. That existed up until very recently, and there are other channels too, operational reporting, commander situation reporting, various other classified channels that can handle and do handle UFO reports, particularly above US military installations, etc. That's what I study, and not enough people are doing it. The UFO community in this particular area simply has not got its act together. If there is a cover-up, they're absolutely laughing, because nobody is doing what they're supposed to be doing and actually hunting it down like that they were doing in the 70s. So that's where that's how I got into it, and that's where I stand today.
Wow, that is really good stuff. Now, the case you brought up, I that is such an interesting case, and it is real. I mean, I've heard the reenactments of that file of the transcription going between the radio tower and the pilot, the young pilot, only 21 years old. Yep. And it is horrifying to hear that whole thing. And that there was never, it's just amazing how the plane just vanished. Yeah,
it was. What happened was, look, he took off. He was going to King Island under the auspices. Look, he was going to King Island, which is 300 kilometres away from where he took off. He was going there at sunset, slightly before sunset, to pick up crayfish, which aren't cheap here. Pick up crayfish, fly back to Melbourne in time for a very late dinner. That's what his fiancée at the time said. That's what his family explained to the authorities. Back then it was the Bureau of Air Safety Investigation, Victorian and Tasmanian region. So that'd be a bit like saying, FAA accidents, Oregon, Washington region, something like that. So he took off, all fueled up. He was, he had some degree of experience. He'd had a pilot's license for quite a while. He'd attempted to join the Royal Australian Air Force Cadets. I think he had actually joined, and he was trying to take it to the next level. And anyway, he took off, and the flight was completely uneventful until he got on the radio, and he said those famous words. We've heard it in so many pilot cases. He said, well, first he said, Melbourne, but his next words were, have you got any traffic up with me, or whatever he said. And of course Melbourne said, no, you shouldn't have any traffic up there. And he said, look, I've got some traffic with me. And the Flight Services Unit Air Traffic Controller, Steve Roby, said, what sort of traffic is it? Describe it. And he said, look, it looks like 4 bright landing lights, flying past me. And then he says it's going at speeds that I just can't identify. And the air traffic controller is saying, look, can you describe it a bit better? The air traffic controller actually took a break for a second and got on to the Royal Australian Air Force and just quickly said to them at Sale Air Force Base, look, are you flying anything near in Bass Strait? And they said no. And they came, air traffic controller Steve Roby came back to the pilot and said, look, is the object or aircraft still with you? And he said, look, it is. It's all metallic-like on the outside. That is pretty weird. He never once said the word UFO. He never once said the word spacecraft or craft. I don't even think he said object. He said again. This part's garbled. It trails out, but he said first he said it was all metallic and shiny on the outside, and then again he said it's metallic, and the air traffic controller was so stunned he just did not. I mean, he's underground back in Melbourne, and this pilot's just flying at 5,000 feet, 4,000 feet. Just so they're both blind to each other. And the exacerbated air traffic controller said, "Roger, what are your intentions?" And the pilot said, "Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet. My intentions are to go to King Island. Melbourne, that aircraft is hovering on top of me again. It's hovering and it's not an aircraft." Now, what's weird is a couple of seconds later, he said, "Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet." Then the sound went bizarre, and it went, Dick Haynes, the NARCAP ex-NASA UAP researcher, actually has he's got a copy. Very few, the actual audio tape of this incident does still exist in a couple of people's hands. Dick Haynes has a copy, and he's released the last 17 seconds of what happened was, as the pilot said the very last words, a bizarre metallic scraping sort of shaking noise. It's almost like someone's gotten a marble inside a tin can and spinning it round. This bizarre noise just goes for 17 seconds. It's like a pulsing metallic noise. It sounds like metal grinding against metal or something like that. It could be something as simple as a microphone rubbing against his jacket, or it could be something, an actual, the extreme extrapolation would be is two aircraft grinding against each other, or a propeller blade slowing right down against a solid body. But this 17 seconds of metallic noise is just bizarre. And then he was never heard from again. Melbourne said, I've got to launch a search and rescue. They launched a search and rescue. Nothing was found. They found a few oil slicks that were from merchant naval ships, like fishing vessels. They found no evidence of sort of like life rafts. They found there was no further radio calls. No one saw the plane land at King Island. So it's a mystery. It's certainly one of Australia's. It's probably Australia's greatest aviation mystery.
Yeah, I would say so. Now there are a lot of sightings that I've heard of, and there was a couple of stories that I heard of I wanted to touch on. But before that, I just want to say that if anyone's listening live, you can jump into the chat room. It's very easy, just 2 clicks, and you can get in there and pose a question. But someone did email a question, and I didn't want to get through the whole show and say, "Oh my goodness, I forgot the question." So, if it's okay, I'd like to ask Charles.
Sure.
Sent me this email, and his question is, quote, "As I understand it, the Aboriginal people have stories in their traditions about sky people, loosely speaking. Do you know if any modern Aboriginals are contactees or abductees, whatever they would call themselves, or are they favored more with sightings than non-natives that you're aware of?"
good question. Yeah, that's interesting. Look, the Aboriginal people have been here for 42,000 years, thereabouts, 40 to 42,000 years. They have extremely significant. Australia's a very, very old country. The Aboriginals have. They have rock drawings, very, very clear, not like some of the stuff you see in Europe that hasn't been touched with floods and wind. They have rock drawings which admittedly are look, they call them all sorts of things, all sorts of spirits of animals, spirits of ancestors, monsters to scare children when they won't go to sleep, etc. They've littered the country with these rock paintings. They do have. I don't know that much about their lore, about their folklore or their verbal history as far as related to, say, what we would call sky beings or extraterrestrials. That's not my area. I don't actually do that sort of thing. But it does come up from time to time. I have seen, you see the odd newspaper article about it, magazine article about it. I would not be remotely surprised if the Aboriginal community do have a similar folklore regarding peoples or whatever from not from Earth. They certainly have spirit realm type people. They're called Quinkans. It's a bit strange. But one thing that the Aboriginals do absolutely stand by like a rock is we have something in Australia called Min lights. That's MIN space MIN lights, and they're both Aboriginals have claimed to have been seeing them for eons. The newcomers, like the British and the Welsh and the Scottish, when they came here, actually saw them as well. And you can see this in old ship logs and old sort of like when mines were like old mining expedition logs and diaries. These strange lights tend to hover near the ground. They hover around. There's often just points of silver light, no bigger than, say, what you in America might call like a 10 cent or a nickel or a dime, maybe a little bit bigger, up to say the size of a golf ball. Quite bright, and they often gather in little groups of 2 and 3 and maybe as many as 10. They zoom around the place. They often might follow a fence line or follow, say, grass or whatever, like a line of grass or a river or something. But the claims, I've certainly never seen them, but the claims are that if you chase these things or scream at them or whatever, that they actually do respond. It would a lot of quite reputable people, archaeologists and geophysical people, seismologists have said, look, these don't just appear to be earth lights or, say, static electricity or ball lightning or buoyant plasma phenomena or atmospheric plasma or, say, even something as simple as truck headlights on the horizon. They seem to be something a bit odder. And whether it's some sort of magnetic anomalies that's forcing electrical conductivity into very confined spaces, or whether it's something paranormal, I don't know. But the Aboriginals have been have been accepting this forever, and certainly in the 60s and 70s, Australia, the wider Australian community started writing about it, reading about it, and so yeah, that's probably the answer to that question.
Now, someone asked on the message board if they have a written language, but they kind of use symbols, don't they? Or am I getting that wrong?
No, they do. Okay, well, now the Aboriginal culture has been, we've absorbed, but it hasn't been a pretty history. It's probably a bit like the combination. It's probably a bit like when the Europeans butted up against the North American Aboriginals, Indians, whatever you call them, in the 1700s. The Aboriginals did everything verbally. They used numbers. They did everything verbally, and most of their written history, as far as I know, is all pictorial. It's all pictures in bright, bold colours. Nowadays, most Aboriginal people have just in the mainstream community schools and so on, so they're just English. But historically, it's always been. I don't think they actually had written language. They certainly didn't have paper. Like when we came here in the 1800s. So,
they were, you're right. I've seen that. There was the Christian movement throughout the world. A lot of the things from British and we were doing things, and going into these cultures and just trying to turn them into toward our beliefs or whatever they are. There was another question I was thinking about along these lines, but I had Shane Ryan on a few years ago now. Real nice gentleman. And somewhere I was reading online, and back in 2014, that the Westall had been solved. Do you know anything about that, or have you looked into that?
Yeah, the guy, I actually live right near it. The researcher who put the solved theory forward, it's a hypothesis. Okay. Mm-hmm. With Westall, just for those who don't know, there used to be a neighbourhood. It's now called Clayton or Clayton South. Here in Melbourne, there's a neighbourhood we call it a suburb called. It used to be called Westall in the 60s, Westall, and there's two schools, a high school and a primary school, quite near each other. And about 10:15 in the morning, pretty clear weather, windy. Either one or two. This is probably one of the big sticking points. We just don't know. But there were so many witnesses, either 1, 2, or 3 bodies, objects, UFOs, whatever, came across the school and appeared to land and then possibly move around a bit, but then definitely take off. Right? There was also planes in the area, like small planes. Not major airliners, but small planes in the area, and this all happened. What's probably, what's important about this case is that there were so many witnesses. Now, most of them were 10, 13, 8, 15, whatever years old. We're not talking about just a whole bunch. We're not talking about a bunch of adults. We are talking about school children. However, there were teachers that did see it. Particularly, there was a science teacher that did witness it. Now, there is like I said, what's interesting about the case as well is that authorities, we don't know who, but in Australia, back in Australia, it was the Royal Australian Air Force's Directorate of Air Force Intelligence who handled the UFO matter. Aside from then, if it was an air safety issue, it would be handled by the Bureau of Air Safety or Directorate of Civil Aviation. Department of Civil Aviation. Now, whatever was the situation in 1966 at Westall, very rapidly authorities were on the scene. Now, some people claim it happened that afternoon, like authorities were on the scene that afternoon in flatbed trucks, in suits and ties. Some witnesses claim they were definitely there the next day. Researchers and journalists at the time say they were there the next day. Some people say it was twice the next day. Some people say it was the day after that. But we do know that authorities arrived fairly quickly. Now, the case has never been solved as such. We're still in the dark entirely. But what happened was, in a couple of years ago, the guy I work with, the researcher I work with most, Keith Basterfield, he started looking into the possibility that it sounds mundane and sounds so cliched, but what about the possibility it was a very, very unusual scientific experiment? Run by, a Department of, Defence, Materials Acquisition, or Department of the Army Aviation, whatever. Because there was so many odd things about the case. In very few cases, or no cases at all in Australia's UFO history has the Royal Australian Air Force, or say the Army, or like high-ranking police, ever been on the scene to hush people up. It just doesn't happen. Very provocative cases, like even that I was saying before, the Frederick Valenti case. We had a pilot die. The Royal Australian Air Force didn't even care. They didn't even get involved. Wow. They weren't even asked to. Yet at Westall, you've got a bunch of, say 150, 200 school kids who see a UFO or UFOs, and all of a sudden there's multiple streams of authorities on the scene. This is really unusual for Australia's UFO history. It almost implies that they knew what it was and they knew it was going to land there. Anyway, so they arrived. The authorities arrived at the school. They told the principal to, keep the kids, get the hysteria down a bit. They interviewed the one teacher that got the best look at it, they interviewed the Royal Australian Air Force interviewed him at his home 2 or 3 days later, 4 days later, and they said under no circumstances like this has got to end. Like this, we've interviewed you now. Please don't discuss it anymore. Now, this is unique, and this is virtually unique. We have no other cases that we actually have on file where where the authorities have been so interested or so sort of almost paranoid about it. Even when there's been even UFO cases right near sensitive military bases, or even UFO cases where packed airliners have been involved, going across the country, the Royal Australian Air Force were never that interested, but this case they were. So researcher Keith Basterfield decided to check out the possibility that it in fact wasn't what we would call a UFO, like something really unusual. He decided that he might look into the possibility that it was a government program that had gone horribly wrong. And what he found, interestingly, was at the time, it wasn't classified, but at the time, the Australia's old Department of Supply, which was kind of a defence science department, they were launching, with the help of the United States' Atomic Energy Commission, they were launching enormous balloons from our state, in a town called Mildura. They were launching huge balloons, and underneath the balloons was huge, long, like metal, like cables that went down to a parachute, and underneath the parachute was a scientific payload, like scientific equipment. Now, this was all under the guise of atmospheric, wind direction testing and temperature testing and so on. What the program, it was called the High Altitude Balloon Program. It was called the Highball Program. And it was, like I said, a joint Australian government defence American program. There was help from NASA and the US Navy. We've got the paperwork for that. The balloons were launched, and where they would go was just dependent on high, medium and high altitude winds. What would happen is planes would actually chase the balloon and the parachute and payload. What would happen is the balloon, the real scientific experiment was that the equipment was actually trying to detect fission materials like I suppose strontium-40 and plutonium possibly from Soviet nuclear blasts or Chinese nuclear blasts that might be going on, particularly in the southern hemisphere. So that was totally classified. That was not known to the public. The program, people who saw the balloons simply saw these enormous balloons with stuff hanging out the bottom, and but really it was quite a sensitive program to look for evidence that the Soviets or Chinese were doing blasting down here. So anyway, what Keith actually found is that he found paperwork he found at the National Archives and through people who used to be with the Department of Supply, he found paperwork that showed that particular week there was a balloon launched scheduled for that week for Westall, like the week that the UFO event happened at Westall schools. Keith found that a high altitude balloon experiment actually was scheduled for that week, but it actually disappeared from the paperwork. Like you've got flights, it's called balloon flights 291 and 293 or whatever it is, but 292 is totally missing. All Keith did was hypothesize, is it possible that the balloon and parachute and payload are screaming across our state of Victoria, planes are chasing it, things get out of hand, the balloon cuts away the parachute and payload drift over Melbourne suburb, heading downwards, and go across the school, land, maybe bounce around, I'm not sure, and kids go hyper about it. It's just a hypothesis. The fact of the matter is, we can look at the original paperwork from the time, and it says that there's no evidence to say that the actual balloon launch did take place. I'll admit that. But it is funny that that's the only classified balloon launch that's actually missing from the records. And interestingly, the winds that day do go direct from Mildura straight towards Melbourne. So it's a running hypothesis. We don't know. No one's really put it's an interesting case. No one's put a proper file together on it. People have material, newspaper articles and witness interviews and maps and so on. No one's put together a proper case file on it, and it's something that does need to be done sooner or later. So yeah, to answer your question, that's what that was all about.
Now, there's a couple of questions I have about that for you, and one of them, I may be getting the case wrong, but wasn't there a teacher that took some pictures and had her camera taken away? Is that this case?
Yeah, that's correct. Okay, the picture part we don't know about. What you see, one thing that just never ceases to amaze me, the garbage that's on the internet it seeps like a poison dye into everything. If you actually ask, that teacher, or ask the original researchers at the time, or go back to the original, rough notes researchers are making, or whatever it may be, if you ask anyone and say, look, was there a camera with photos? Were photographs taken? Was the camera snatched? Okay, the fact of the matter is we just don't know. There was definitely a camera that was, we're pretty sure that there was a camera taken by authorities. Whether it had actual photos in it, we don't know. Whether it had film that was going to be developed in it, I don't know. Where it went, I don't know. Whose it was, I'm not even sure which teacher it was. I haven't looked that much into the case, but I do know that particular area of the case is very, very murky. There's an enormous amount of murky things about it. I mean, probably the biggest, like I said, was I've heard anywhere between, some people insist there was one UFO, a lot people insist there were two. Some people say three. I've never heard four, but now I'm increasingly hearing people say there were five there. Then there were planes. So it's a very frustrating case. We've wasted so much time on it. I mean, it's 50 years old. Not enough news has come out about it. Certainly no government files have come out about it. What really needs to happen is that resources get put together and either put the thing to rest or solve it. But it seems to be very, very difficult to do.
Right. It's almost like our Roswell in a type of way. And then the next question I have for you, the balloon theory, does that fit what the witnesses were describing? I mean, how did it go away? I mean, from what I remember, the thing actually lifted up and took off. Yeah,
flew off. Okay, this is the part we don't know. Okay, the balloon theory is actually wrong in that Keith Bastfield's hypothesis was never that Keith's a UFO researcher. He's just as adept to saying it was a real UFO case than not. But what he's actually saying is that like balloon wouldn't have been anywhere near it. The balloon would have been, like, if it was this, what happens is the balloon with the parachute and the payload under it fly across Victoria, and at some point through remote control or cutting or whatever, the parachute and payload get cut away from the balloon. The balloon, by the time, if this happened, by the time it got to Westall School and came overhead, the balloon could have been 20 or 100 miles away, whatever, or long gone or quite high up. He's not saying that the balloon's too big. It's a huge, very vertically high body. That, I think what he's saying is it possible that that the parachute and payload flew into Westall and then bounced back out again. That's what he's saying. See, the problem is we have so little material from the time. We don't have what the kids were seeing at the time. Most of the people that have been interviewed about this case have been interviewed after sort of 2006 or 2004 or whatever. So they're going on 40-year-old memories. We just don't have any original material. I keep screaming out to people, show me some original reports, even drawings. Kids love to draw. There's nothing. There's no diary entries, no school diary entries, exercise books. There's no original, report forms that we can get hold of. There is no original material. Wow. And to me that, there's very little original material. One thing we do have is James E. McDonald, the great University of Arizona professor. He actually came to Australia and after it happened. And he interviewed the science teacher who witnessed the event or saw a lot of the event once it had started. James McDonald interviewed teacher Greenwood, Andrew Greenwood, and so Greenwood gave him quite a good interview, like solid answers, only a year after it happened. And that, I haven't heard the interview because it's at the Arizona University. A few people have copies of it here. I haven't heard it. But that, if you're going to go on one report, I would go back to his, because, he made he's one, he's an adult, and two, he was interviewed by McDonald only, a year after the event happened. So his material will probably be the most accurate. So like I said, the problem is we just don't have enough original material. There are so many better cases where we've got report forms, pro formas, unit investigations, weather maps, weather data, NOTAMs like notice to M and restriction, controlled airspace map layouts, placement of radar facilities. Where there's so many better cases where there's excellent data to go on, reams of it, scope photographs, actual media player track files, rough hand drawings from the site, military base alerts, teletype messages, auto DIN messages, oprep 3s, even fuel requirements for planes to take off and actually intercept a bogey that's appearing on a ground control radar screen. Even ammunition logs, how many bullets were fired at it. We've got so many cases where we've got that sort of material, but in this case, in the Westall case, we just don't. So it's turned, it seems to be more folklore than anything.
Right. This is where we take our quick break, but I'm not going to do any music on this one right here. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. So it is funny how there is so much out there about this particular case, and I think I thought it was a pretty good documentary, but I don't know how you felt about it. Starts out with a guy looking at the crib and his baby in the crib, and starts thinking about the whole story. Do you remember that particular documentary on this?
No, I haven't seen it. I've got it. I've never to this day gotten around to seeing it. I've always just read the paperwork on it, like the books.
Yeah.
No, it's something I've got to do.
Yeah. Okay. So that's it for the show. And the second part of this show is really great. He talks about some amazing UFO sightings and all kinds of things. I highly suggest you listen to the whole show, and you can do that by supporting us for a one-time payment per year or just $2 or more per month. And to do that, you go on podcastufo.com. You'll see the support menu at the top. And we have a lot of expenses to this show, which is a gold-plated problem. We get so many downloads that just our bandwidth alone costs quite a bit per month. Plus, we're traveling out west to bring you a live show at the UFO Congress, and perhaps another show out in the California area. I'm not sure at this point. But anyway, thanks so much for listening. Our guest next week will be Paul Kimball. And I want to thank a few other people besides the guest. The guest I thought was great, and I'd like to get him back on another show at some point. Peggy Shunning for managing the Facebook page. Keith Rowland for running Dark Matter Digital Network, where our show plays. You can listen to the whole show for free every Thursday at 9 to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks so much. And remember, you can always listen live for free at podcastufo.com from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Remember to keep your eyes to the sky and your curiosity high. How do you like that one?